John wrote, "I looked, and behold, a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand." A pair of scales indicates scarcity of food. An illustration of this can be seen in the book of Leviticus, where the Lord pronounced, "When I have cut off your supply of bread, they shall bring back your bread by weight, and you shall eat and not be satisfied." The next verse in Revelation 6 says, "And I heard a voice saying, a quart of wheat for a denarius." A quart of wheat equals a daily ration for one person. And at the time of the Apostle John, a denarius was 1 day's wage for an average worker. The voice John heard was saying that a day's ration of basic food will cost the equivalent of an average worker's entire daily wage. Such hyperinflation follows a dreadful famine. Just before mentioning pestilences, Jesus said, "There will be famines." This shows that what Jesus pointed to here matches the third horse.
This encyclical comes at a critical moment in human history. The ecological crisis is essentially a spiritual problem. The sin against the environment, the ecological sin.
This is big for the Pope. Consume less and buy less. We have to really rethink our lifestyles.
He blames a lot of it on society's throwaway culture.
He tweeted out that the earth, our home, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth.
Immense pile of filth.
Pile of filth.
The encyclical Praise Be is the most important papal document ever on the environment, backing the science on climate change, blaming free markets, holding rich nations responsible. Environmentalists and many on the left are cheering the message.
The encyclical is very clear that it does not believe that market mechanisms are going to get us there.
And it's put conservative Catholics like U.S. presidential hopeful Jeb Bush in a tough spot.
I don't get economic policy from my bishops or my cardinals or from my pope.
Since the Argentinian Archbishop became Pope, Francis has shifted the focus away from the Church's conservative stance on things like abortion and made attacks on inequality and the excesses of capitalism central.
He is launching a broadside on many of the things that we take as commonplace.
For some, it's like Occupy Wall Street took over the Vatican.
This is just pure Marxism coming out of the mouth of the Pope.
He has a Marxist background.
We have never seen catastrophic flooding like this, and the NOAA is now telling us that there will be more major flooding for at least 2 more months. On Thursday, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration warned that historic, widespread flooding would continue through May. More than 90% of the upper Midwest and the Great Plains currently covered by an average of 10.7 inches of snow. All of that snow is starting to melt. That means that we are going to transition from one of the worst winters in modern history to a flood season that has already taken an apocalyptic turn for farmers all across America. At this moment, millions of acres of farmland are already underwater. Thousands of farmers are not going to be able to plant crops this year, and thousands of other farmers that have been financially ruined by the floods will never return to farming again. This is already the worst agricultural disaster in modern American history, and it's going to get a whole lot worse. I posted an article about this crisis yesterday. I am troubled by the fact that most Americans don't seem to understand the gravity of what we are facing. Millions of bushels of wheat, corn, and soybeans have been destroyed by floodwaters. Hundreds of millions of dollars worth of livestock have been lost, and all of us will soon be feeling a lot more pain at the grocery store. And this would be a complete and utter national nightmare, even if the flooding was all over. But the NOAA just told us that we should expect more catastrophic flooding for the next 2 months. In fact, the NOAA is using the words unprecedented flood season to describe what is coming, and they are warning that more than 200 million people are at risk. Forecasters warned the floods would likely to continue through May and could worsen in the coming weeks. This is shaping up to be a potentially unprecedented flood season, with more than 200 million people at risk. Ed Clark, director of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's National Water Center in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, said on Thursday in the agency's spring outlook. Of all the natural disasters that we've seen in recent years, this is the biggest. And U.S. food production is going to be dramatically affected because many farmers will not be able to grow crops at all in 2019. The reality is this isn't going to be over for a very long time, Jorgensen said. It took years after 2011 for people to come back. For me as a farmer, there are flooded acres here that to think that I'll be able to plant a crop in 45 days is just virtually impossible. And many farmers will never recover from this disaster at all. According to one farmer in Iowa, somewhere around half of the farmers in his entire county will not be able to come back from this. The amount of food that has just been lost is absolutely staggering. Due to the trade war, farmers were storing more wheat, corn, and soybeans than ever before, and now the floodwaters have destroyed much of what had been stored. As prices plummeted last year amid the ongoing trade fight, growers faced with selling crops at a loss stuffed a historic volume of grain into winding plastic tubes and steel bins. Some cash-strapped families piled crops inside their barns or outside on the ground. Farmers say they're now finding storage bags torn and bins burst open, grain washed away or contaminated. I want to share it again. As of December 1st, producers in states with flooding, including South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, Wisconsin, and Illinois, had 6.75 billion bushels of corn, soybeans, and wheat stored on their farms, 38% of the total U.S. supplies available at that time. That's according to U.S. Department of Agriculture data. And remember, the flooding is just getting started. In just one county in Iowa, 1.8 million bushels of corn and soybeans have already been destroyed. Nationwide, the losses are off the charts. Needless to say, prices will be going way up at the grocery store, and they will be keeping going up for the rest of the year. Sadly, even after the floodwaters are gone, the damage that has been done to our agricultural infrastructure will take years to repair. As the waters began to recede in parts of Nebraska, the damage to the rural roads, bridges, and rail lines was just beginning to emerge. This infrastructure is critical for the U.S. agriculture sector to move products from farms to processing plants and shipping hubs. The damage to roads means it will be harder for trucks to deliver seed to farmers for the coming planting season. But in some areas, the flooding on fields will render them all but impossible to use. In Nebraska alone, hundreds of miles of rural roads have been completely washed out, and farmers such as Annette Bloom are having an extremely difficult time just getting to a main road. We are having to travel 3 miles through pasture and cropland just to get out because our roads are gone, she says. And the cornfields are going to be devastating to get in and plant and get that going, because usually we're planting within the next 2 weeks, and it's not going to happen. Many of America's farmers will bravely keep going after this disaster, but for many others, a financial breaking point has arrived. Farm bankruptcies has already surged to the highest level since the last recession prior to all this flooding. And now this crisis will end up driving many of them away from the profession for good. The following comes from NBC News. Some farmers in Fremont County will probably not return to till their soil, many farmers here said. Lots of folks won't be able to continue after this, said Julius Schaff, 66, who said 1,500 of his 4,000 acres were currently underwater. In the end, it is going to be a while before we know the full extent of the damage to America's farms and our food supply. But all of the experts agree that it will be unprecedented. Food prices are already high, but the truth is that this is as low as they are going to get. much less food will be produced in our heartland this year, and that will mean skyrocketing prices at our grocery stores. And this is just one element of the perfect storm that is emerging. According to Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue, there may be as many as 1 million calves lost in Nebraska due to the catastrophic flooding that has hit the state. This is not a rumor, this is not an exaggeration, and this is not based on any sort of speculation. This number comes to us directly from the top agriculture official in the entire country, and it means that the economic toll from the recent floods is far greater than most of us had anticipated. You can watch Perdue make this quote on Fox Business, and it is important to remember that this number is just for one state. It is hard to imagine what the final numbers will look like when the livestock losses for all of the states affected by the flooding are tallied up. This is already the worst agricultural disaster in modern American history, and the National Weather Service is telling us there will be more catastrophic flooding throughout the middle portion of the nation for the next 2 months. Nebraska Governor Pete Ricketts said that this is the worst flooding that his state has ever experienced. Ricketts originally told us that 65 out of the 93 counties in his state have declared a state of emergency, but that number has now risen to 74. Hundreds of millions of dollars of damage has been done in his state alone, and that is just an initial estimate. It deeply offends me that the big mainstream news channels have spent so little time covering this disaster. This is the biggest news story of 2019 so far by a very wide margin. But because it happened in the middle of the country, they're not giving it the attention that it deserves. In the short term, food prices will not rise too dramatically because the stores are selling the food that has already been produced. But as the months roll along, you will start to notice food prices steadily increase. Beef will never be lower in price than it is right now, so if you are a beef lover, you may want to stock up. Dave Eden's family has been farming the same plot of land for 152 years, but now the Missouri River has swallowed his farm, and with much more flooding still to come, he anticipates that his farm will be underwater all year. The farm has been in his family 152 years. He was born there. He's been thinking about what he's learned about the Missouri's upstream reservoirs and the mountain snowpack and what it means for his land. It's not like I'm new to the area, he said. My gut feeling is we're going to be underwater all year. And he is definitely not the only one that has had his year ruined. Panovich said that the hay and silage that were meant to feed his cattle this season were soaked in 3 to 4 feet of water. The hay and silage to feed his cattle is soaked. Sand now covers much of the pasture land he uses to graze his herd of commercial Angus cows and purebred Charolais bulls. In the eastern Dakotas and Minnesota, more than 20 inches of snow remains on the ground. The record-setting floods deluging the Midwest are about to get a lot worse. Fueled by rapidly melting snowpack and a forecast of more rainstorms in the next few weeks, federal officials warn that 200 million people in 25 states face a risk through May. But the National Weather Service is telling us that nearly the entire eastern two-thirds of the nation will be dealing with flooding this spring.
The worst agricultural disaster in modern American history, your new grocery bill, and Bible prophecy. Let's talk about that. This is Nebraska, one of several states devastated by water. Lots of water.
They're telling everybody just grab what you can and get out. Now we've lost everything.
Over 1 million acres of American farmland flooded. Crops, livestock, roads, dams, homes, destroyed. 3 people have died.
It's hard to really describe the devastation that we witnessed. It looked like an ocean, and I mean, I saw the top of grain bins, we saw buildings flooding. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And you know, that's people's lives. Those are fifth generation farms. Those are businesses, communities.
Across the Midwest, farm losses alone are estimated to top $1 billion. But no one really knows just how much this disaster will add up to. Too much is still underwater. Even worse, more flooding is expected in the next few months. This is the worst agricultural disaster in modern American history. What caused it? In March, a highly unusual weather disaster hit the middle of America. Meteorologists call it a bomb cyclone. This is an extremely rapid pressure drop over a 24-hour period. It hit the central United States from Minnesota all the way down to Texas, but the breadbasket states were hit hardest. Making matters worse, this monstrous storm hit after a very cold winter. Most of the ground up north was frozen. It couldn't absorb any of the water and rain runoff. Now, 9 major grain-producing states are underwater. It so happens that farms in many of these states were storing up a huge amount of grain because of the trade war with China. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration says that soaked grain has to be destroyed. That grain is gone. On top of that, this is the time of year when farmers prepare to plant wheat, corn, and soy. Submerged fields can't be planted. Waters may not recede in time to sow, causing farmers to lose an entire growing season. And reports say the floods may have damaged the soil in ways that might render it unusable even beyond just the current year. This means shortages of beef, dairy, wheat, corn, and soy products. And that means your grocery bill is about to go up. This is a disaster that will affect all Americans. But there's more to it than that. The effects are only half the picture.
Blizzard is about to strike in the upper Midwest, bringing wintry conditions to nearly 11 million Americans. This storm is huge. Storm warnings are up from Colorado to Minnesota this morning.
Forecasters say some areas will get more than a foot of snow, April snow. It means more challenges for some of the areas left underwater by the bomb cyclone last month. Lonnie Quinn, chief weathercaster of our New York station WCBS TV, is tracking this from Lonnie. Good morning.
Well, good morning to you, Nora. Good morning, everybody. Here's the deal. You got a big storm. I really believe the brunt of it, the worst of it, is going to be in South Dakota and Nebraska. But that's not the only spot. This storm is so big. Take a look at the wind field. Severe wind warnings or wind watches extend 705 miles to the west, 701 miles to the south, and as this system pushes off to the east, it's going to be pulling in some very cold air to the north. So not necessarily a rainmaker, big snow as well. I think the biggest snow totals are going to be felt in this area shaded in pink around Watertown, South Dakota. You're looking at maybe 1.5 feet of snow.
This is 5 in 10 from Skywatch TV. 5 topics in about 10 minutes for June 18th, 2019. I'm Derek Gilbert. Topic number 5 today, Iran and the Persian Gulf. The Iranian government is being blamed by the United States for attacks on 2 more oil tankers last Thursday. A Japanese tanker and a Norwegian tanker hit reportedly by limpet mines. The crews forced to abandon ship and leaving the tankers burning near the entrance to the Strait of Hormuz. About 30% of the world's oil flows through that strait. If it's closed, that would be a devastating blow to the global economy. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says that intelligence sources confirm that Iran is responsible. However, the owner of the Japanese tanker said that his crew saw a flying projectile, a missile perhaps, approaching the ship before the explosion, and that the explosion took place above the waterline. In other words, not a limpet mine, and this contradicts the reports from the U.S. military. President Trump reiterated that Iran is in fact responsible. Of course, Tehran denies culpability. The USS Bainbridge, USS Mason guided missile destroyers have been sent to assist the Japanese ship. The Norwegian tanker, the Front Altair, currently surrounded by Iranian gunboats. Situation in the Gulf very, very tense. Now, complicating things, the attacks on these ships took place while Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was wrapping up a state visit to Tehran. Why would Iran attack a Japanese tanker while the Japanese Prime Minister is a guest in their country? That seems odd, foolhardy perhaps, but again, Iran says we didn't do it, and we will see. Why would Iran even want to ramp up tension in the tension in this area? Well, the economic sanctions imposed by the United States, for one, if things get really bad economically inside Iran, there could be enough unrest to change the government there, which is something the Ayatollahs do not want. Lieutenant Colonel Bob McGinnis sends along this analysis. Most Americans don't want to go to war with Iran, and about 80% of us, according to a recent poll, believe there will be some form of diplomatic resolution here. The president might feel that his hands are tied. If he loosens economic restrictions, economic sanctions, that could be used against him in the upcoming presidential election by political opponents. On the other hand, if he doesn't, Iran might, out of desperation, be forced to do something really foolhardy. Colonel McGinnis concludes his analysis by writing, quote, hopefully the Washington political class are listening to the people and will call off the dogs of war until our national interests clearly demand action by other means, end quote. Amen. Now, meanwhile, a day after the tankers were attacked just outside the Strait of Hormuz, reports emerged that Iran-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen are beginning to shoot at and hit American aircraft. Houthis released some video footage and photos showing a Reaper drone being shot down and crashing. The authenticity of the video and photos not yet confirmed, but CNN reported yesterday that a Reaper had been shot down over the Red Sea. And U.S. officials say it was likely an Iranian missile fired by Houthi rebels. Just one more iron, one more spark in this bit of tinder here that is the Persian Gulf. And while all this is going on, Iran has announced it's going to breach on June 27th the limit on its stockpile of enriched uranium. This is the deal that was reached under the Iran nuclear deal, from which President Trump has announced our withdrawal. The Atomic Energy Agency in Iran said it had quadrupled its production of enriched uranium, which is used to make reactor fuel for power plants, but could also be developed further into nuclear weapons, potentially. But Iran added there was still time for European countries who were partners in this nuclear deal to protect Iran from added U.S. sanctions. In other words, we'll stop if you give us what we want. The UK, France, and Germany all warning Iran not to violate the terms of the deal. Topic number 4, moving on, China. The French press agency reporting a suspected explosion near the border between China and North Korea, which appears to look like an earthquake, but could also possibly be related to a new nuclear weapons test. Now, again, it may not, because an earthquake back in March turned out to have nothing to do with any kind of missile test. So this could just be a classic example of bad timing, because Chinese President Xi Jinping is on his way to North Korea to visit with Kim Jong-un later this week. Thursday and Friday. This will be the first trip to Pyongyang by a Chinese leader in 14 years. Meanwhile, President Xi is dealing with unrest in Hong Kong, where, according to organizers, some 2 million people have taken to the streets to protest a controversial extradition bill, which would allow people suspected of crimes to be extradited from Hong Kong to mainland China without due process. Now, police said the turnouts were considerably smaller than 2 million. They estimated about 338,000, but still, these people hit the streets to protest, even though the proposed bill was suspended on Saturday. And Hong Kong leader Carrie Lam apologized for putting it out there, obviously misjudging the reaction of the people. Topic number 3, the Pope and climate. Pope Francis said Friday that carbon pricing is essential to stem global warming, and he appealed to climate change deniers to listen to science. We are listening. It's just not saying what you think it is. Anyway, climate pricing, or carbon pricing rather, is applying a tax based on energy used, presuming that it's coming from a carbon-based source like coal or petroleum. Pope Francis addressed a meeting of energy executives. A 2-day meeting in Rome called for open, transparent, science-based, and standardized reporting of climate risk and, quote, radical energy transition, end quote, away from carbon to save the planet. Just a minute. Okay, who pays, who gets the money collected from the carbon tax? We would like to know. What are they going to do with it? We would like to know. This is not about saving the world. This is about controlling what average people like you and me can do to heat our homes, run our computers, and make our coffee. It's not about climate. It's about control. Topic number 2, corn planting in the Midwest may be worse than even the U.S. Department of Agriculture is forecasting. Corn farmers dealing with a lot of headwinds. Record rainfall that is drenching the Midwest, flooded the Mississippi to record levels, and has stalled corn planting. Normally this time of year, corn is nearly belt high in places like Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana. But this year, a lot of the crop is not even in the ground. Only 73% of the acreage planted in Illinois so far, 67% in Indiana. Iowa, surprisingly for all the flooding, 93% is in the ground, but it's not nearly as tall as it should be. This has forced the Department of Agriculture to cut its estimate of this year's corn yield for the first time, well, for only the 4th time since 2000 in the month of June. I mean, when we get later into the season, during drought years and things, the USDA will adjust its forecast up and down. But it's doing so earlier this year, and that's the point. The fact that fields are still flooded in many places is really going to impact the corn crop this year, which will affect us, will affect what we pay for fuel, as ethanol is not as available. And of course, exports to other nations that depend on American corn will also be cut.